Okay, thanks to everyone for coming out today. It's nice and warm here in Ream Library and nice and full, which I like to see. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports programs that foster meaningful dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can learn more about our programs and watch past lectures, and eventually this will be a past lecture, and you can watch it online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. Today's lecture is part of our Hebrew Bible lecture series under the aegis of the Kraft-Hiatt program for Jewish Christian understanding. I want to thank our Kraft-Hiatt faculty and advisory committee, and particularly our Hebrew Bible professor, Mari Leonard Fleckman, who initiated this lecture with classics professor Dominic Machado, and welcome to their students from the honors seminar, Resistance Then and Now, which our guest speaker, Hebrew Bible scholar Rhiannon Graybill, will be visiting tomorrow. Rhiannon Graybill is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. Our own Professor Klingard went to Rhodes College. Her research interests include gender and sexuality, feminist and queer criticism, and the Bible and literature. She's the author of, there we go, I'll show it off for her, Are We Not Men? Unstable Masculinity in the Hebrew Prophets, and Text After Terror, Rape, Sexual Violence, and the Hebrew Bible, both published by Oxford University Press. She's edited 3 books, Rape Culture and Religious Studies, Critical and Pedagogical Engagements with Cooper Minister and Beatrice Lawrence, The Bible, Gender and Sexuality, Critical Readings with Lynn Huber, and Who Knows What We'll Make of It, What If We Ever Got Our Hands on It, The Bible and Margaret Atwood. With Peter Sabo, she wrote that. She's currently finishing a commentary on the book of Jonah with Stephen Mackenzie and John Keltner, and she's editor of the scholarly journal, The Bible and Critical Theory. So very busy. We're glad that she came amidst all of that to speak to us, and welcome to Rhiannon Graybill.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for the invitation. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for coming inside on this really nice day. I heard it was not so nice a lot of the winter, so I'm sorry to take your sunshine, but I will cheer you up by talking to you about biblical rape stories. So this talk will include a description of sexual violence. I'm guessing you got that from the title, but just know that that's coming for you. So I want to talk to you today about how we should read biblical rape stories. In particular, I want to challenge the idea that we should make consent the centerpiece of our discussions about sexual violence. Consent has become the primary framework for talking about rape culture, and sexual violence. Colleges and universities teach and increasingly require affirmative consent as a precursor to sexual activity. Enthusiastic consent at every stage, even consent is like tea. I'm guessing some of you have seen this YouTube video. Yeah, a lot of you have seen this. If you haven't seen it, you don't need to look it up, but the whole premise is that consent is like tea. You shouldn't give it to somebody who doesn't want it. Consent has likewise become a rallying point in feminist activism against sexual violence, especially on college and university campuses. Consent discourses also dominate discussions of rape in the Hebrew Bible. Depending on how familiar you are with the Bible, it may surprise you, or it may not surprise you at all, to find out that the Bible is filled with stories about rape. Just as colleges, universities, and other social and public health bodies have turned to consent education as an easy solution to sexual violence, so too is it tempting to use the framework of consent to understand and respond to sexual violence in the Bible. To the question often lobbed at biblical rape stories, but was it rape? The framework of consent offers an easy shortcut to an answer. Did she consent? Was it verbal? Was it enthusiastic? Was it non-coerced? However, I hope to persuade you today that consent is not the appropriate framework to approach biblical rape stories. Consent fails as a framework because it doesn't really capture the ways that sexual violence is fuzzy, messy, and icky. As a result, it's both insufficient and insufficiently feminist. Instead, we need to find other ways of reading and responding to rape stories besides trying to determine whether or not the characters in them consented. So my argument today is going to have 3 parts. Oh, that's a picture. Those are biblical rape stories. We'll be talking more about those. My first part of my argument is that I'm going to flesh out the claim I've just asserted, that sexual violence in the Bible is fuzzy, messy, and icky. After describing these 3 terms in greater detail, I'll offer 3 biblical examples the story of Dinah, which you find in Genesis 34, the story of Tamar in 2 Samuel 13, and the story of Lot and his daughters, which is in Genesis 19. Second, I'm going to elaborate on this critique of consent and why consent is an inadequate framework to apply to any of these stories or to biblical sexual violence more broadly. I'm going to acknowledge here, I know that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I am not opposed to consent as such, but what I am opposed to is using consent as a framework to think about biblical rape stories. So that's what we'll talk about in the second part of the talk. And then third, I want to give you some alternative strategies for responding to biblical rape stories, again with reference to the three examples of Dinah, Tamar, and Lot's daughters. These strategies will include refusing innocence, which is a position I associate with Donna Haraway, who's a feminist theorist, resisting paranoid reading, which I borrow from queer theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, tracing sticky affects, which is an idea I associate with queer feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed, and reading through literature. And here I'll talk in particular about Margaret Atwood and Octavia Butler. And if you feel like there were a lot of things in that list and it's not on the slide, don't worry, we're coming back to it. So first, I want to talk a little bit more about fuzzy, messy, and icky. In my book, which is now in your library, which is called Text After Terror, I argue that sexual violence in the Bible and in everyday life is frequently fuzzy, messy, and icky. Fuzzy names the ambivalence that surrounds many situations of sexual violence. An ambivalence that extends to the complex feelings of survivors. Messy identifies the aftermath of sexual violence and the ways it defies a tidy resolution, or the way that survivors' stories often can't fit into a neat, preordained narrative of suffering and recovery. And you can think about how often, if you're a survivor, the way that you try to tell your story sometimes feels messier than the story that people want you to tell. Icky describes bad sex, uncomfortable sex, regrettable sex, and sex in a gray area between sex and rape. Icky also describes how we feel when confronted, for example, with a suggestion that sex and rape are not always clearly distinguishable, or that consent is not always an adequate notion for adjudicating sexual violence. If you feel a little bit uncomfortable with me suggesting that consent is not going to save us here, you might think about that as a kind of ickiness, right, that consent isn't going to be the perfect solution that we want. But to develop this further, let's turn to some biblical examples: a fuzzy story, a messy story, and an icky story. So first, for the fuzzy story, I want to talk about the Rape of Dina. Perhaps the most famous rape story in the Bible is also its fuzziest, the story of Dinah, which happens in Genesis 34. The story begins with Dinah going forth to visit the daughters of the land. Her visit, however, is quickly curtailed by violence. When Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the region, saw her, he seized her and lay with her by force. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. Following this encounter, Shechem seeks to marry Dinah. Her father Jacob agrees, but Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, object because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They insist that Shechem and his men be circumcised, and this is all a big trick, because as the men are recovering, the brothers massacre all of the Hivite men. When Jacob protests, they reply, "Should our sister be treated like a whore?" Dinah herself remains silent for the text, and her fate is unknown. This story is fuzzy on several levels. The first concerns translation. So I have here that Shechem takes Dinah and lies with her and lay with her by force, or another translation is he takes her and lies with her and violates her. And this last Hebrew word here is inah. But the problem is the question of how you should translate inah is actually unclear, because biblical Hebrew doesn't have a single unambiguous word that means rape, although this is the word that comes the closest. So we have a fuzziness between our modern word rape, and there's no precise equivalent in biblical Hebrew. Furthermore, the idea of rape assumes a subject who's able to consent or to withhold consent. Women aren't understood to have this personal power in the Hebrew Bible. This translational fuzziness leads to a larger narrative fuzziness. Because the Hebrew Bible does not differentiate between willing premarital sex and premarital rape, both of which are punished in the same way, with a fine and a marriage, it's possible to argue, based on the information presented by the text, that Dinah is in fact a willing partner. So if you're familiar with The Red Tent, which is a novel, and then also there's a Lifetime original movie adaptation, this retells it as a love story, and that's actually something that's possible given the way that the Hebrew is written. So you can see this is a fuzzy story in several ways. Now I want to talk about messy, and I want to talk about the Rape of Tamar. Almost as famous as the Rape of Dina is the Rape of Tamar at the hands of her half-brother Amnon. Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom are all children of David, and Tamar and Absalom are full siblings, whereas Amnon is their half-brother. Amnon sexually desires Tamar and comes up with a plan to entrap her alone in her room by pretending to be sick. David commands his daughter Tamar to bring him food, which she does. Amnon then solicits sex by saying, "Come, lie with me, my sister." Tamar verbally refuses him. She answered him, "No, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do anything so vile. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you be one of those scoundrels in Israel. Now, therefore, I beg you, speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." Nevertheless, he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he forced her and he lay with her. In the aftermath of the rape, Tamar begs Amnon to marry her, and he refuses. Subsequently, her full brother Absalom kills her half-brother Amnon and later rebels against his father, David. As critics, both feminist critics and non-feminist critics, have pointed out, the story of Tamar's rape is narrated in such a way that makes it fundamentally a story about men. Tamar is secondary, even in the account of her own rape. And for these men, the aftermath of the rape is messy. Indeed, the rape itself is at once central to the narrative and secondary to it. It's not Tamar, the raped daughter, but Absalom, the wronged brother and beloved son, who's the emotional focus of the passage. As a common feminist slogan about sexual violence has it, women have a past, men have a future. And so too, it's the futures of Amnon, Absalom, and the Davidic monarchy, not the future of the daughter herself, that receive attention from the text. And so you can think about, if you're familiar with the story of David and his children, Absalom is very much an emotional focus in the text, whereas Tamar is kind of written off after her rape. Consider as well another messy detail of the story, Tamar's desire to marry her rapist. Prior to the rape, she begs her half-brother to marry her instead of simply raping her. After the rape, she describes Amnon's expulsion of her from his house, and thus his refusal to marry her, as a greater harm than the rape itself. "This wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." This is a messy response. Tamar fails to act as a victim of sexual violence ought to act. She doesn't display proper self-actualization or a Tarantino-esque desire for vengeance. Other characters, such as Absalom, criticize her response, but Tamar's emotional response to her situation remains a messy one and not necessarily what we would want for her. So now let's think a little bit about Icky, and let's think about the story of Lot and his daughters, which is the final of the 3 rape stories I want to introduce. Lot and his daughters reside in the city of Sodom, and you might know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a setup for this rape story. God sends messengers to the city, and Lot invites them into his home as guests. Shortly after, the men of Sodom knock on the door and demand to rape the visitors. Lot, trying to be a good host, offers his virgin daughters as a substitute, but the messengers intervene and prevent anything from occurring. They then rescue Lot and his family, and his wife, you might remember, is famously turned into a pillar of salt, and then God destroys the city of Sodom. Following the destruction, Lot and his daughters take refuge in a cave in the hills. In a bid to ensure their survival, the daughters take drastic action. And the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there's not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the world. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so we may preserve offspring through our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. The next day, the same thing happens again, but with the younger daughter, who also becomes pregnant. Thus, both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. This is clearly a story of sexual transgression, though of what sort is not immediately clear. One reading is that the daughters rape their father in order to produce children, or perhaps as revenge for the fact that he earlier offered them up to the would-be rapists in Sodom. Another possible reading suggests that the daughters are in fact the victims. The text presents the incestuous desire of the father, then covers up this desire by making the daughters into responsible agents. Still, other readers offer other readings. For example, that the daughters act in a courageous way to increase human survival, or that the point is not the daughters at all, but rather the sons to whom they give birth. So really this is a story about why the Israelites' neighbors, the Moabites and the Ammonites, the descendants of Lot's daughters, are in fact incestuous bastards. What's undeniably clear about this story is its ickiness. First, it violates the incest taboo, and in a shocking way. The story becomes even ickier through the presence of excessive drinking, which suggests uncomfortable parallels to sexual violence on college and university campuses, as well as its repetition of rape or sex, which happens not once but twice, putting pressure on the question of who knows what when. Thus, the daughters are nameless and semi-interchangeable as a finally icky touch. And if you don't believe me this is an icky story, just go find a room of college first years and teach them this story, and you will feel just how icky it is to talk about this story. So fuzzy, messy, and icky. Drawing on these categories and the three stories I've described, I want to turn now to the second part of my talk, which is a more systematic critique of consent. My goal here is to show you why consent or non-consent is not the right framework to apply to any of these stories, whether Dinah or Tamar or Lot and his daughters. So let's talk about some problems with consent. The first problem with consent is that consent discourses assume a liberal Enlightenment subject. This assumption prevents a complex analysis of rape culture. A fundamental issue with consent concerns the sort of subject that discourses of consent assume: a self-contained, self-controlled, and self-evident subject. The consenting subject is a liberal Enlightenment subject, the subject we encounter in Kant and Locke, and so on. As we know from a lengthy tradition of feminist critique, this subject, while putatively universal, is often coded as male, as white, as owning property, as able, and so forth. Therefore, there's at the very least an irony in predicating a feminist theory of how to end sexual violence on the very figure feminist theory has so vigorously critiqued. This is also a very different kind of idea of what it means to be a subject than we find in ancient Israel or in the Hebrew Bible. The second problem with consent is that consent discourses ignore more subtle techniques of power, such as discomfort. The model of all subjects is equally empowered to give consent ignores the weight of our personal histories, as well as the contingencies that attend any given sexual interaction. The assumption that all subjects can simply give or withhold consent also neglects the influence of more subtle forms of pressure, as well as discomfort. This is a point that Sarah Ahmed has analyzed in Willful Subjects. Taking up the fuzzy, messy, and icky problem of why people will consent to painful, dangerous, or simply undesired situations, Ahmed draws out the power of discomfort, which she calls, quote, a polite strategy or technique of power, the capacity to carry out will without resistance or with the will of others. The significance of discomfort and its role in leading victims and survivors to compromise their own wishes or will is a point made again and again in contemporary analyses of rape culture. So think also about how important feeling uncomfortable in a situation is when we talk about those sort of situations that lead us to situations of sexual violence. As Ahmed writes, we also need to hear the cases in which yes involves force, but is not experienced as force. When, for instance, a woman says yes to something as the consequence of saying no would be too much. If being willing does not mean the absence of force, then we need to account for the social and political situations in which yes and no are given. If the first episode in the Tamar story, when her brother forces himself on her, is the violence that converts no into yes, then what follows, when Tamar expresses her desire to marry Amnon even as she mourns the rape, offers an instance of saying yes to something as the consequence of saying no would be too much. Thus, the Tamar story is one more case study in why people willingly agree to situations in which their safety and well-being are compromised. A situation that consent discourses, in their rigid and positivistic formulations, are unable to accommodate. Perhaps this is why so much feminist scholarship on Tamar focuses on the rape itself or on mourning with or for Tamar, and not the question of why Tamar might ask to marry her rapist. So if you've read a lot of biblical scholarship about sexual violence, a significant amount of it is about feeling bad for biblical victims, about mourning, about grieving, about revoicing, and we think about how we focus on that and not other details in the text. The third problem with consent is that consent discourses neglect intersectional analysis, especially concerning race, sexuality, and disability. We all know that the right to say no has historically been denied to many categories of people. This persists today. Research on bystander intervention, for example, shows that bystanders are more likely to intervene to help a white woman than a woman of color, and a straight-presenting heteronormative woman rather than a queer person. Consent discourses are also informed by racialized assumptions surrounding sexual violence. In the contemporary United States, the victim of sexual assault is imagined as a white woman. Rape is figured as a threat not just to women, but to whiteness. Furthermore, the imagined whiteness of the ideal rape victim is bound up with the implied blackness or brownness of the imagined rapist. While the Hebrew Bible views race somewhat differently, ethnicity is very important, especially in stories where Israelites interact with non-Israelites. We should pause here and remember a detail from the Dinah story. Dinah and her family are colonizers on indigenous Canaanite land. Shechem, the rapist, is an ethnic other. This doesn't mean that Dinah isn't raped, but it does mean we should take seriously the long history of racialized conversations around rape, including with respect to this story. This also sets up my fourth point about consent, which is that consent risks becoming colonialist. Consent discourses are often used as part of a practice of saving women or recovering women. This is especially clear in scholarly and devotional responses to the story of Dinah and Tamar, which are almost obsessive in their desire to remember, recover, and revoice. The desire to save or recover women, while grounded in feminist commitments, is uncomfortably close to the desire to save women that post-colonial and decolonial feminist theory has so soundly critiqued. If colonialism is, quote, white men saving brown women from brown men, as Gayatri Spivak has quipped, then this certainly involves saving from rape. The fifth problem with consent is that it's a legitimized form of subordination. Another serious concern with consent discourses is the way that they inscribe relations of subordination. This is especially the case with respect to gender. The framing of consent assumes that sex or rape is something done by one person to another. These positions, moreover, are typically gendered. As Wendy Brown writes, if in rape law, men are seen to do sex while women consent to it, if the measure of rape is not whether a woman sought or desired sex, but whether she acceded to it or refused it when it was pressed upon her, then consent operates both as a site of subordination and a means of its legitimation. As Brown draws out, discourses of consent assume power relations. Consent is something that the more powerful, typically male partner, seeks from the weaker partner. Consent does not share power as much as it repeats and reinscribes these relations of domination. For this reason, it's not very well suited for a feminist reading of the Hebrew Bible and of sexual violence. And finally, and importantly, consent is a low bar. Consent discourses risk evacuating the question of sexual pleasure from sex. As I've argued elsewhere, consent is a low bar. Or as Kelly Oliver writes, affirmative consent should not be conflated with desire. Just because a woman submits to sex does not mean that she wants it, especially in a culture where women feel pressured to please men. Or, even more clearly, as a college student activist told feminist writer Rebecca Traister, seriously, God help us if the best we can say about the sex that we have is that it was consensual. To this, I will add only that we might say the same about sex in the Bible. So we've got some issues with consent. So if not consent, then what? I want to talk now about how we can read rape stories, if not with reference to discourses of consent. And I want to offer you 4 strategies. The Hebrew Bible is filled with fuzzy, messy, and icky stories of sexual violence. The bad news is that consent is insufficient to address these complexities, as even a cursory examination of the 3 stories shows. Instead, we need new approaches and new tools. The good news is that there are other interpretive options available to us. Here I want to mention 4 strategies I find especially helpful: refusing to claim innocence, avoiding paranoid reading, tracing sticky affect, and reading with literature. So first, we should abandon claims to innocence. This is an idea I adopt from a number of feminist theorists, but most directly from Donna Haraway, though it has many related iterations in feminist and queer theory. As Haraway argues in a number of famous essays, including Situated Knowledges and a Manifesto for Cyborgs. Have you read the Cyborg Manifesto? When I was in college, all we did was read the Cyborg Manifesto, and it feels like it's gone out of style a little bit, but it is a fantastic piece of literature that's also very widely available online. I recommend it as a work of feminist theory, and it's relevant to this project. So as Haraway talks about in a Manifesto for Cyborgs, and also in her essay Situated Knowledges, there is no master vantage point or innocent subject position from which the world can be judged. Interpreters and situations are never innocent. We are always implicated in situations, texts, and spaces of interpretation. All knowledge is situated knowledge. Or as Haraway herself writes, acquiring knowledge is never innocent. What does it mean to refuse to claim a position of innocence? It means rejecting reductive historicizing oversimplifications, such as the suggestion that if women are not legal subjects with the ability to consent, then unwanted sex is not rape, which is a specific argument about rape in the biblical world that I find especially objectionable. Dropping the posture of innocence means being wary of sloganeering applied to the past, even when such slogans speak of feminist truth to the present moment. In place of simplicity or certainty, a non-innocent reading practice pursues complexity, a process that Haraway terms, elsewhere, staying with the trouble. It's tempting to demand that Dinah and Tamar and Lot's daughters and the many other sexually victimized and violated women of the Bible add their voices to the Me Too movement. And such efforts can be powerful for survivors and religious communities alike. However, refusing a position of innocence means insisting as well that the messy contours of these stories exceed scripted sound bites. Staying with the trouble means reading these stories as stories of sexual violence without erasing their other ambiguities and complexities, but also holding space for ambivalence, even ambivalence in and toward our own desires. It means acknowledging larger and more complicated realities, even when they challenge a straightforward victim-perpetrator narrative. In the case of Dinah, this might mean taking seriously that Dinah and her family are colonizers on indigenous land. In the case of Tamar, it means acknowledging that Tamar's champion and defender, her brother Absalom, is himself a rapist. There's another story where Absalom rapes his father's concubines. And David, the father, is hardly innocent. In fact, this is a story about intergenerational trauma and abuse. Refusing the position of innocence seems, at first, perhaps easier in the case of Lot and his daughters. No one seems to be very innocent in that story. The plan is clearly the daughter's idea, but Lot is in many ways an undesirable character, from his terrible job hosting the divine messengers to his earlier offering up of his daughters to be raped. Maybe everyone is a bit to blame. In any case, refusing innocence in the case of Lot and his daughters means refusing to claim an innocent exterior position from which we can judge the events of the cave. Refusing innocence is linked as well to the refusal of purity. Just as there are no good or pure options available to Lot's daughters, who believe themselves and their father to be the sole human survivors, so too should we refuse easy judgment. Moving beyond an insistence on innocent subject positions and the purity of categories is a necessary step. So we need to set aside this kind of obsession with an idea of claiming an innocent subject position. The second thing that we should do is we should avoid paranoid reading. The notion of paranoid reading comes from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick in an essay entitled Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid You Probably Think This Essay Is About You, which is such a good title. Sedgwick argues that the hermeneutic of suspicion, the cornerstone of so much feminist and queer work, is basically structured as paranoia. So the hermeneutic of suspicion is a traditional way that a lot of progressive biblical scholarship works. Basically, you approach the text from an attitude of suspicion. You're going to find all the kind of oppressive structures in it. So Sedgwick gives us 5 key parallels between the hermeneutic of suspicion and paranoia. Paranoia is anticipatory. Paranoia is reflexive and mimetic. Paranoia is a strong theory. Paranoia is a theory of negative affects, and paranoia places its faith in exposure. These are all features that paranoid reading shares with paranoia. As an anticipatory form, paranoid readings are constantly looking forward to and preparing for bad news. So everybody knows that the Bible is terrible for women. Why would this text be any different? Paranoid readings offer strong theories, like everything in the Bible can be explained by misogyny. Paranoid readings are organized around negative affects, which is a way of saying that they're invested in forestalling pain at the expense of seeking pleasure. So I won't let the Bible hurt me anymore. I am prepared. Everything I read I know will be harmful. I am not open to any kind of possibility of pleasure. And paranoid reading practices believe that exposing something will suddenly lead to it being changed. If we only knew that the Bible was misogynistic, everything would be different. Much feminist work on the Hebrew Bible has its starting point in paranoid reading. Sedgwick's reading, which is grounded in queer, but also feminist commitments, invites us to open up texts, even texts of sexual violence, to other ways of thinking. Especially useful is her reminder that to be other than paranoid is not to deny injustice or oppression. So what does it mean to do a reading of Dinah or Tamar or Lot's daughters that resist paranoid reading? Sedgwick gives us the alternative of reparative reading, which seeks not suspicion or paranoia, but rather flexibility, openness, and even pleasure. Instead of exposing what's purportedly hidden, reparative reading is additive and accretive. It's location and context specific. Instead of making sweeping claims, it looks at specific moments in the text. Importantly, also, for Sedgwick, the paranoid and the reparative are positions, not people, which means even if you have been a paranoid reader in the past, it is completely possible for you to move to a position of reparative reading. A reparative reading of the 3 stories considered here resists the urge to make sweeping generalizations that would encompass all 3 stories or all biblical rape stories or rape as such. Reparative reading does not dismiss the pain of these stories, but it also insists that we should look for the possibility of the after, what poet Emily Dickinson calls after great pain. Paranoid reading suggests that after rape, nothing is ever the same. Reparative reading, in contrast, suggests that we can imagine an after sexual trauma in the Bible, without erasing that trauma itself. Instead, this is a practice of finding space. As Sarah Ahmed reminds us, an aspiration is originally space to breathe. To be other from paranoid is not to deny the suffering, pain, or tragedy. It's simply finding space to breathe for texts, for characters, and for ourselves. So my book is called Text After Terror. And what I do in that book, beyond what I'm talking to you about today, is look at how else we could read biblical rape stories, what other kinds of afters are possible for us. So holding open the possibility of an after is an important part of a reparative reading practice. The next strategy is watching for sticky affects. I'm sorry, this is just sticky candy. I couldn't come up with a good picture of affect theory. So in thinking about non-innocent, non-paranoid responses to sexual violence in and beyond biblical texts, it's also vital to think about affect and affective contagion. In The Promise of Happiness, Sarah Ahmed describes how objects become affectively charged as good or bad objects. She further suggests that the stickiness of affect means that this goodness or badness can be transmitted between objects. Elsewhere, I've talked about how institutional responses to sexual violence often inadvertently treat survivors as unhappy objects because they serve as reminders that the violence prevention campaign has failed. So in some ways, a survivor of a rape or a sexual violence experience is unhappy for the institution because she shows us that our prevention campaign was not, in fact, a success. Survivors can also become unhappy objects when their stories fail to conform to certain preordained narrative trajectories. Just as the woman who overreacted to sexual violence was once scorned, in the present moment, there's a criticism of survivors who fail to narrate their experiences properly, even as there's also this demand to tell your story. So as a survivor, you're supposed to share your story, but it's supposed to be a certain kind of story that you share. And the invitation to share stories can also itself be a kind of compulsion or kind of icky situation. Centering affect, with attention to its stickiness, ickiness, and messiness, helps open up the stories of sexual violence in multiple ways. Sticky affect and the stickiness of sexual violence explains why the sexual transgressions or rape that immediately precedes the birth of Lot's grandsons contaminates those grandsons and the Moabites and the Ammonites, the people descended from them, more broadly. It helps name the fear and loathing of the rape victim's body that we find elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. For example, in the unclean skirts of the raped woman in Lamentations, or in the unclean female body in the marriage metaphor in Ezekiel. It also helps explain the particular affective experience of reading and teaching biblical rape texts, especially when we consider that we are always teaching and talking about these stories in groups that include survivors and also perpetrators. Another clear example of sticky affect and its usefulness in thinking about sexual violence is the story of the Rape of Tamar. Tamar is an unhappy object in multiple ways. This is immediately clear in Amnon's reaction to her. After the rape, he's filled with loathing towards her. Tamar is also an unhappy object, though differently to her brother Absalom. He rejects her desire to marry Amnon, and by extension, her narrative of the events, urging her instead to be silent and calm. Affective contagion also gives us another model for thinking about the way that Tamar's rape spreads bad feelings and trauma through David's family, without hedging in the text and foreclosing other feminist and queer ways of thinking, while constraining Tamar to the exclusive position of victim. Of course, it's messy and a bit icky to think about Tamar beyond the moment of her rape, and yet it's also necessary if we're to find other feminist ways of being with these texts. The fourth and final tactic I want to talk about is reading with literature, and this is pretty straightforward. I want to suggest that we gain new and vital perspectives on biblical rape stories when we read these texts with and through other literary works. This is especially valuable because literature models alternative ways of narrating sexual violence, rape, consent, harm, desire, and ambivalence. So in my book, I bring in a lot of other literary texts. I talk about Margaret Atwood, I talk about Sally Rooney, I talk about Carmen Machado, I talk about Chanel Miller, I talk about the viral short story Cat Person. I think that when we bring texts like these when we cause them to encounter the biblical text, this helps us to understand sexual violence differently. So I want to talk about two examples with you. The first example, I don't want you to read the quote yet, but I will tell you it's from The Handmaid's Tale. Margaret Atwood's famous dystopian novel about a future America. How many of you, Handmaid's Tale, familiar? Yeah, most of you? If not, The Handmaid's Tale is about a future America, which is called Gilead, where women are forced to serve as reproductive surrogates for infertile elites. The novel is narrated by one such handmaid, Offred. One of the most famous or infamous details in the novel is what's called the ceremony, in which the man of the household, who's known as the commander, has sex with his handmaid while she lies between the legs of his wife. And this is modeled on the forced surrogacy using handmaids in the Bible, such as Hagar and Bilhah and Zilpah. The ceremony is widely recognized as rape, and the biblical handmaids are also increasingly described as victims of sexual violence or rape. But also, interestingly, This isn't actually how Offred, who narrates The Handmaid's Tale, actually describes the experience. She says, "My red skirt is hitched up to my waist, though no higher. Below it, the commander is fucking. What he is fucking is the lower part of my body. I do not say making love, because this is not what he's doing. Copulating two would be inaccurate, because it would imply two people and only one is involved. Nor does rape cover it. Nothing is going on here that I haven't signed up for. There wasn't a lot of choice, but there was some, and this is what I chose." Offred claims in this passage that she's not raped. In fact, she explicitly rejects the term rape, instead offering a taxonomy of forms of limited consent. And this is actually a really disturbing passage, right? I had read The Handmaid's Tale. I was a feminist biblical scholar. I was writing a book about rape. I was teaching The Handmaid's Tale. I reread it, and I was really struck by this passage where Offred rejected the idea of rape, which I was certain what was already going on in this passage. So it's tempting, when you read this, to suggest that Offred must be wrong and that she really is a victim. But at the same time, it's troubling to offer a reading that dismisses Offred's own analysis, or that suggests, more generally, that women are not able to judge or understand their own experiences. This is perilously close to the old desire to save women, which I've already mentioned in the critique of consent, or to the old misogynistic line that women are not qualified to speak for or about themselves. But I'm also unsettled by an intellectual position that allows for rape to be something that women choose, even though I know that many women and many people face precisely such constrained choices. Think about Lot's daughters and Lot believing they're the only humans left. Recall Tamar asking for Amnon to marry her. How far is this from Offred? In her words, "There wasn't a lot of choice, but there was some, and this is what I chose." A second example comes from Octavia Butler's science fiction. Butler is the author of multiple works of science fiction that explore sexual relationships and sexual coercion between humans and non-human others. Do we have any Octavia Butler readers? Some? Okay, not as many, also really great. Butler's most famous works include the short story Bloodchild, in which mostly benevolent aliens can reproduce only by gestating their eggs in human hosts, and the Xenogenesis, or Lilith's Brood trilogy, in which aliens preserve a handful of humans following a massive nuclear war on Earth, and then they try to rehabilitate the human species. These aliens, who are known as the Oankali, also engage in sex, not always consensually, with humans, and eventually create a new hybrid species with them. As with Atwood, I'm especially interested in how these works by Octavia Butler represent non-consensual sex, and how this might help us put pressure on consent and think differently about both sexual violence and its afters. My thinking about Butler is guided by the work of Cooper Minister, who's written about sex and alien encounter to explore feminist and disability responses to consent. Drawing on Butler, Minister problematizes a binary understanding of consent or non-consent, suggesting it fails to do justice to the complexity of the narratives. They write, "The word consensual cannot describe the human-alien encounters in the Xenogenesis series, Bloodchild, or Amnesty. Butler does, however, consistently describe these encounters as pleasurable. While the compromised nature of communication and the lack of clearly definable individual boundaries do not excuse the overt forms of violence sometimes exerted by aliens against the humans, it can help explain why the encounters between the humans and aliens can be described as both coercive and pleasurable. There is, Butler's stories seem to suggest, a crossing between pain and pleasure." Minister further suggests that we can use Butler's work to open up a conversation about sexual violence and sexual pleasure that moves beyond the liberal model of the subject and the binary formulation of consent and rape. Minister's reading of Octavia Butler opens the biblical text in a number of ways. Though the Hebrew texts mostly lack the narrative pattern of rape by a god that's prominent in, for example, other mythic traditions, there are occasional divine sexual encounters with humans in which consent is not clear. God's sexually inflicted opening of the bodies of his male prophets offer another example of non-consensual but perhaps pleasurable alien encounter. Applied to the biblical texts, Minister's work also directs our attention to alterity or otherness. We find this in the Dinah story. Dinah and her family are literally aliens in the land of Canaan. As many feminist critics have pointed out, we don't know how Dinah responded to the rape. At least one midrash speculates that Dinah enjoyed sex with Shechem and had to be dragged from his home, when that's in Genesis Rabbah 80. While most modern readers, including almost all of my students, find this suggestion repulsive, Minister's theorization of sex and alien encounter opens a space to consider it and the question of pleasure more broadly without falling into a romanticizing rape erasure. We might think similarly, if carefully, about the various non-rape arranged marriages in Genesis and the Deuteronomistic history. I don't perceive much pleasure when I read the stories of Dinah or Tamar or Lot's daughters, even compromised pleasures, such as Minister describes. But positioning these stories in conversation, the complex and non-consensual sexual encounters of feminist science fiction, challenges our easy assumptions about the stories. More than anything, reading the text with speculative and science fiction, and with their complexity surrounding sex and rape, encourages us to think beyond the moment. The first sexual encounters between the aliens and Lilith, heroine of the Xenogenesis trilogy, have clear overtures of rape. Were we only to read here and stop, we'd have a very different perception of the text. But the book continues, the series continues, and the sexual encounters become something more complex. While the biblical narrative is, of course, different, reading with this in mind also urges us to think beyond the tragedy of the moment. We can commemorate, but we can also think beyond simply a posture of grief, even to imagine new forms of erotic flourishing which remain unspoken and unspeakable when consent is the only language available. So consent, it seems, has edges. This can be understood in two ways: as the points where consent falls off or fails, and as a zone of possibility for a more complex understanding of sexual violence. The edges of consent are sometimes fuzzy, sometimes messy, and often icky. They threaten to wound us, but they also suggest a possibility of a beyond, to pain and trauma and grief. Rape and rape culture remain challenging and sometimes shattering matters, in the biblical text and even more so in the world. In pushing back against consent discourses, my aim has not been to reject consent itself, which plays an important role in contemporary understandings of sexual encounter and sexual violence, but to summon us as feminists to think beyond the limits of consent. Consent discourses flatten out and erase the fuzzy, the messy, and the icky. They impose anachronistic and anti-feminist notions of the liberal subject onto the text. They ignore discomfort and other subtle forms of coercion. They neglect race, ethnicity, and other forms of intersectionality. They risk slipping into a colonialist project of saving women, and they legitimize subordination. And they set too low of a bar, foreclosing questions of pleasure. And yet we also have alternatives. I've described for you 4 alternatives today: abandoning claims to innocence, refusing paranoid reading, attending to sticky affect, and reading with literature. All of these offer different ways of thinking about sexual violence, beyond consent and non-consent. They all represent efforts to explore what else we might do with biblical rape stories, and what comes after rape, after misogyny, after, in Dickinson's phrase, great pain. The work of feminist criticism is about finding ways to read and live with biblical rape stories. It's not about looking for easy frameworks to solve difficult questions, or refusing to struggle with difficult texts, nor is it about simply ignoring or removing the hard parts. To do such feminist work is, instead, to stay with the fuzzy, the messy, and the icky, even or especially when such reading seems difficult. Difficulty is part of the project. And if biblical rape texts compel us in any way, if they place any demands on us, it is this. Thank you.
So I have a question. So you said that Tamar fails to act how a victim of sexual assault should act. Do you think that it's limiting our reading of the story and that it's harmful to say that a victim should act in a certain way?
Yes, absolutely. That is exactly my point. And I'm sorry if I didn't word that clearly. My point is just like you said, that there are the idea that a victim or survivor of sexual violence ought to behave in a certain way and do certain things is itself a limiting script, which is anti-feminist, which is against the interests of that victim or survivor, and which shows a kind of failure of imagination and also is a kind of oppressive story to put on someone. So precisely, I think when we feel that the story, that the character doesn't do what we think they ought to do, we should think about why there are certain assumptions that we bring to the text. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. How would you tell survivors of sexual assault today to get to their after that you described in your talk using your framework?
Oh, that's a great question. So one thing I would say is that I don't think that there is one person who should tell survivors the one right way to be a survivor. And so even, right, we've used the language of victims, we've used the language of survivors. I think even something like that, what term we use, should be up to people. So I think This is not to put the question back on you, but I think it's important that we, in general, sort of listening and following the lead of victims or survivors is important. So I see my job as a biblical scholar to make more space around biblical stories. I don't think that there's one path that we need to follow in order to move from sort of bad, damaged survivor to good, overcoming survivor. There's a book called Queering Sexual Violence, edited by Jennifer Patterson, which has made a big impression on me. Patterson talks about, so it's a collection of essays, and many of the essayists talk about surviving sexual violence and then, for example, being at a campus rally or Take Back the Night and feeling like they're not the right kind of survivor because they haven't done the right sort of things. And so I very much want to avoid giving a sort of, these 7 steps will heal you, and I want to reject a kind of model that sexual violence is something that we need to overcome and have a kind of healing sort of goal. This is something I talk about later in my book, where I talk about the Book of Lamentations, which is another story where we have an example of a biblical character, daughter Zion, who's a victim of sexual violence but also doesn't follow the script that we would like. So she's a victim of rape, but she doesn't talk about her own kind of experience. She's a sort of unsavory character in other ways. And in that chapter, I talk about sort of, and I draw on work also by disability and crip theorists about sort of letting go of the idea of cure or the idea of fixing and sort of holding a possibility for maybe our lives will never be fixed and they'll still be great and that's okay. So I think instead of I think the framework I want to give you is 1, the language of fuzzy, messy, and icky as a way of talking about how sometimes our experiences don't sort of map onto the clear-cut categories that are given to us. And 2, the kind of idea of there just being multiple afters, multiple possibilities, and not one sort of scripted path. So I'm sorry, I wish I could give you like 7 steps and it would be fixed, but the whole point is that I can't give you that. Yeah, does somebody want to go to the microphone?
Sorry about that.
It makes it dramatic.
So all 3 of the stories that you mentioned had sort of other elements that made them sort of more disturbing. Like Dinah, you talked about there was the complication of like foreign and race relations, and then the 2 other stories both dealt with incest. Is there anything that we can sort of draw on? Like, are there stories where there are not further those other further complications, or should we, like, I don't know if it's like I would be like reading it in the wrong way to say, like, is there a conclusion we can draw from the fact that all 3 of these stories aren't sort of straightforward rape stories?
That's a good question. So, and I hear in your question also asking, is there a good example that doesn't have all of this other stuff around it, right? Is that maybe part of it?
A little bit.
And so the first thing I would say, and this goes along with the sort of the idea of reparative reading and attending to specifics, every rape story has a larger kind of context to it. And so I think the idea that we talk about the idea, most experiences of sexual violence on college campuses are not the rapist in the bushes, right? So we'd like it to be like a bad stranger jumps out of the bushes and attacks the innocent woman, and we can all have a sort of scripted emotional response to that. So first of all, I want to resist the idea that there's any kind of straightforward story. There are always more fuzzy, messy, icky complications. That being said, I do talk about some other rape stories in my book. So for example, maybe the story of David and Bathsheba is an example you could look at. The complication there is it a rape story or is it a love story, right? There's a whole artistic tradition of this is the great love story of David and Bathsheba. So yeah, there isn't really just a straightforward one without the baggage, but I think also in thinking about it as baggage, we also sort of get at some of our uncomfortableness about thinking about the sort of everydayness of sexual violence. This is something you see a lot in writing by contemporary survivors. There's a book edited by Roxane Gay, Not That Bad, Dispatches from Rape Culture. So consistently, victims and survivors will say, oh, well, what happened to me was not that bad. And there's a way of kind of downplaying our own sort of experiences. And so I think that attending to the details and also sort of the stickiness, the thickness of every story is important to it.
Thank you.
I was wondering when you were talking about the places where the issue of consent isn't clear-cut, I was wondering if you think that just an alternative way to preserve the idea of consent as a way to look at it while still acknowledging that would to be thinking of consent as a spectrum rather than just given or not given, or whether you think that wouldn't be a good way to approach the problem.
Yeah, that's a great question. So another model for consent that sometimes comes up, which I've also critiqued, is the idea that consent is like a stoplight, right? Red means go, yellow means slow down or speed up. No, slow down. Green, wait, I got that backwards. Green means go, red means stop, and yellow we sort of ignore. I think a spectrum is moving towards a richer kind of idea of consent. I think that also there's been some interesting work in feminist sexual ethics about thinking about anti-ableist ways of thinking about consent. So for example, we often talk about consent as being verbal, and that's important in many kind of college sexual violence policies, right? It needs to be verbal and enthusiastic, and there's a critique, right, that excludes some people from the possibility of giving consent. And so I think that thinking of it as a spectrum or thinking about multiple modalities as one way to sort of move beyond a kind of yes-no model of consent that ignores the richness of our experiences, of our interpersonal relations. There's a good book called Screw Consent by Joseph Fischel, who is a feminist legal scholar, which I think gets into some of this. I am not saying that we should throw out consent. I'm saying that, and here I'm following Fischel, we sometimes ask consent to do more work than it's able to do. And part of that is we ask it to do it on a kind of thin, impoverished binary model, which is what you're asking about. And I think a richer model of consent is one sort of part of that. And the other part is just thinking about what work are we asking consent to do, say, in sexual ethics that should be elsewhere. So for example, the college where I teach, Rhodes College, has a student group called Culture of Consent. And that group started around sexual violence advocacy, but they're also asked to do work about sexual pleasure, to do other kinds of feminist work, to do queer work on campus. I would say that we should have other kinds of spaces, and consent shouldn't be asked to do all of that work. And I think that also it should be a richer idea of consent, like you're pointing at. So thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you.
I had a question. You mentioned in your talk about why consent isn't adequate, about consent assuming a liberal entitlement or enlightenment. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of how it relates to the women in these stories of rape, because I think a lot of times we assume in liberal enlightenment that they're male figures, and that you talk about Kant and these kind of philosophers as being like really male-centric. So I was wondering if you could just kind of touch on the way consent and liberal enlightenment affects women and affects women's stories in terms of their use or non-use of consent.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So the way that we talk about consent, right, it often comes from a legal framework. And so consent is something, this is what the Wendy Brown quote I gave you talks about, right? Consent is something that the more powerful person gets from the less powerful person. Consent also assumes, and this is something we see in contemporary law, for example, certain kinds of people are able to consent and certain kinds of people aren't able to consent. So for example, if you are under 18, you can't consent to certain kinds of sexual acts, right? If you are intoxicated, you can't consent to certain things. If you are not in your right mind, you can't consent to certain kinds of things. So there are certain ways of being in the world that are not ways that allow you to consent. Does that make sense? Does everybody follow? Another example would be there are famous cases involving Alzheimer's, right? If you have sex with your partner and they have Alzheimer's and they can't remember, is that rape or is that consensual sex? And you can think about all of these kind of questions. This is a contemporary way of thinking about consent. There was a move in biblical studies when we wanted to start thinking about sexual violence and taking it more seriously, where we kind of were like, oh, well, we'll just take the modern idea and just apply it onto the ancient texts. And so a kind of classic clunky move is you look up the FBI's definition of what a rape is, and then you apply that to biblical text. You can see like why this would be an anachronistic and not super useful way to think about biblical text. Because in the Hebrew Bible, women are not considered to be subjects in the way that they are now. This also plays out. The flip side of this is that there is a sort of line of argument that takes seriously the idea that women aren't considered full people in the Bible, but then uses that to say that we shouldn't really we can't talk about rape because women aren't people anyway. So there's a famous article, could a woman say no in ancient Israel? And the answer is no, she couldn't, because that wasn't a right that belonged to her, it belonged to the men in her life, so either her father or her husband. I think the problem with this is it's technically correct, right, from a legal perspective, but it also gets us off the hook. We're like, oh, we don't need to worry about sexual violence. Like, they weren't people anyway. That's not the kind of argument we want to make, right? That's ethically impoverished. It's also ignoring what's going on in the text. And so I think our challenge as interpreters is to think about how we can think about literature and think about the past without simply imposing our modern concepts, but also what other kind of contemporary ideas could we bring to open the text in different ways. So that's why I turn to something like Margaret Atwood or science fiction instead of just sort of assuming the idea, we should sort of like take Kant's idea of a subject and just like add women and mix. Like if we make the women into Kantian subjects, it'll fix the problem. We know that that doesn't work. I think I maybe got a little bit beyond your question, but does that?
I don't want to steal a mic from students, but here I am. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm really curious. I want to go back to the question, like 2 questions in about the after, because I find that super liberating from a contemporary perspective, but really messy from an ancient perspective. So, I mean, I think that it's really helpful for us today to just remind people that there is an after and that everyone gets to dictate what that is and be empowered by that. But what's possible when we're talking about like ancient stories, like these horrifying ancient stories? How far can we push them? How far can we imagine? What's too far? And what might be an unethical after or unethical interpretation of these stories?
Yeah, and what's tempting, I think, is that we want to fill in the we want to give our characters happy endings, right? Like we want to find some kind of after to trauma, and we want to fill it in, and we want to have those sort of details. And I want to both insist that there is an after and refuse to fill it in for you. And so also in my book, I talk about unhappy reading as a method. And I talk about unhappy reading as an alternative to telling sad stories. So Phyllis Tribble, who is this great feminist biblical scholar, says the job of feminist criticism is to tell sad stories to us. And I think the problem with telling sad stories is it kind of fills in the content. And so I offer unhappy reading as an alternative that's more dynamic, that also it could be that you're unhappy about the story you're telling. You could be unhappy about the lack of closure. You could be unhappy in the sense of a plot, right? It's not felicitous. It doesn't fully wrap up. I'm interested in thinking about after. So I mentioned that Tribble's book is called Texts of Terror. This is a really famous book of feminist biblical criticism. She says she's going to tell sad stories in memoriam, so to remember 4 biblical women who have suffered. And those 4 biblical women are Tamar, who we talked about today, Hagar, who is the slave of Sarah, who is raped by Abraham, Jephthah's daughter, who is sacrificed by her father, and the Levite's concubine, who is an unnamed woman who is gang raped and murdered. And so these are 4 horrible biblical stories, which is where we get the phrase texts of terror. And Tribble really drives the point home. In the book, she has actually drawings of tombstones for the 4 women. But what's interesting, and what I became a little bit obsessed with in thinking about this and really got me thinking about the after, is 2 of those women aren't dead, and 2 of them are. So Tamar is not dead at the end of her story. She is not happy. She is miserable. She is shattered, but she's not dead. And Hagar is also not dead. And I also then started to notice this tendency in scholarship to talk about especially survivors of horrific sexual violence as good as dead. And so there's a sense in talking about like the Levite's concubine is this story about a gang rape and murder, and there's this kind of really icky refusal to differentiate between those 2 experiences and sort of talking about her rape is the same as her murder, it's her social murder. And so I started to think about how I want to insist it's important that some of these women are not dead. And so and that seems very obvious when you say it, and yet it also is very much kind of counter to this well-intentioned, ethically driven feminist practice. We can think about how we want to mourn for these characters, we want to grieve for them, we want to write Me Too speeches for them, but then also that's limiting kind of the possibilities that are available. So at the same time, I'm not giving you a content of the after. I just want to say they're not dead, and it might not be this nice, tragic story. In some ways, right, tragedy can be very cathartic. We want a nice, good, unhappy ending, and sometimes the Bible just gives us messiness, which is actually a lot more like everyday life in a lot of ways. I'm sorry, I feel like every question someone asks for a clear answer, and I'm like, it must be messier and ickier and fuzzier. But I guess that is my point.
Hi, I want to go back to your categorizations of fuzzy, messy, and icky, because I don't think I would ever expect to go to a scholarly talk and hear the word icky. So I just want to ask about your process of choosing those categories and choosing more like maybe personal or relatable words as opposed to as opposed to more esoteric ones?
That's a great question. So one source that was influential to me in making this choice, there's a book by the affect theorist Anne Svetkovich called An Archive of Feelings, where she talks about using everyday language as a kind of intentional scholarly gesture, as a way of kind of breaking down the sort of calcification around theoretical terms. So that was part of it. I also found, I started working on this project, right? I teach at a liberal arts college, not unlike Holy Cross. I was teaching biblical studies classes. I was teaching about sexual violence in the Bible, and I felt like the way that the scholarship was talking about sexual violence and the way that I was hearing about it from students and the way that I was hearing about it from my friends and my kind of everyday sort of conversations about sexual violence, there was just such a large disjoint between them. And so I intentionally wanted language that wasn't preacher language, that wasn't sort of legal language, but that sort of touched on the way that we talk about. So I got really interested in how we say things like, oh, like he's a little bit sketchy, or like it was a weird night, or like, oh, like that's a little bit creepy. Like there's a whole way, and some of this has to do with Title IX and mandatory reporting. There's a whole kind of second level of conversation where we say things without saying things. And I think that many of us are familiar with those kinds of conversations with peers or with friends. And so I wanted to think about sort of how we could bring that vernacular language to talking about biblical sexual violence. I wasn't sure about icky at first, right? Like fuzzy felt like it worked, messy. Icky seemed maybe too, like you say, like too little kiddish almost. But I also found in talking about this project while I was working on it, icky was the term that stuck. Maybe there's just a lot of ickiness in the Bible, which I would say there is, but there's something about icky that gets at sort of what otherwise slips sort of between the categories our language gives us, and so that's sort of where that came from.
So much for your talk. I have a question. I'm not quite sure how to formulate it, so I'll do my best. But I'm curious, for a lot of the students here, the Bible is also a sacred text, in addition to being great literature. And so I wonder how you think about the significance of that or the relevance of that for what you've offered us today.
Yeah, this project I think is really important to thinking about the text in that way too. So I also think about the way that these stories are used in sermons, right? The way that, for example, the story of Dinah gets preached. And so I think about also the way that survivors will talk about going to church or going to synagogue and feeling re-traumatized by the way that biblical stories are talked about. And so I think that can happen a couple ways. It can be the total ignoring of sexual violence that can happen. It can also be a kind of, could you imagine, Dinah? Can you imagine a worse thing happening, right? And if you are a survivor and you're in the congregation and you're getting this kind of script, it's then doubly alienating. So I think that if you approach the Bible as a person of faith, it's also important, first of all, to acknowledge these horrible things in the text, but then also to find ways to live with the biblical text. And I think a lot of the times it's going to leave us unhappy. Like, I can't give you a Bible that is all happiness and joy and good ethics, because that's not the Bible that we have. There's another Margaret Atwood novel, The Blind Assassin, where one of the characters takes her scissors to the Bible and she takes out all the things she doesn't like, right? And she gets like a nice, good Bible. It's very short, but it's like she gets all the good stuff. But I think that if we want to reckon with the Bible as a text of faith, we have to also deal with the icky stuff in it. And so I see this also as opening that possibility. Now, I'm a biblical scholar and not a theologian, and so I also see my work as kind of setting up a scaffolding that then also hopefully feminists and queer theologians can build on. Cooper Minister, whose work I talked about with science fiction actually, is also a theologian, and so that's another kind of point of connection. Although they've sort of moved out of theology, but there are traces everywhere.
Hi, sorry that took a long time. This feels like a runway. Thanks for your talk. It made me think about Ovid's Metamorphoses, and in Latin, there are a lot of different ways to translate the word rapta. I have Whitaker's words up here. It can mean like drag off, snatch, seize, carry off, and it can also mean rape. And I was just wondering what you think about like the way that different translations can, in a classroom affect that the way classical texts or just, biblical texts also are read. Because I feel like sometimes if a student or even a professor says like, oh, well, this can be translated not as rape, it can be translated as carry off or seize, and like, well, is the translation and the diction the only thing that's important here? Like, how would you go about that in a classroom?
Yeah, I think you're getting at such an important rich problem in translating these texts and teaching these texts. I think also picking up on, I think adjacent to your question, there's also the question of when we translate it as rape and when we translate it as carry off or seize, right? And this picks up on some of what I was saying about intersectionality, right? We could think about how, for example, there's often a blindness to seeing male victims of sexual violence in ancient texts. There's often a kind of erasure, like if it's in a framework that could be read as romance, there's a way of kind of romanticizing, there's a way of ignoring certain forms of sexual violence. There's also a kind of, I think, well-intentioned, sometimes desire to say, no, it's not really about sexual violence, it's about something else, which can be a way of maybe reducing discomfort in the classroom. I think it can be very much about sort of trying to make the text gentler, maybe. In some ways, it's similar to, we all know that children's Bibles, what they put in and what they leave out is very telling. And it can sometimes do some of that kind of editorial work also. I think in teaching, it's important to think about and talk about the semantic range of these terms, right? And not sort of ignore sexual violence. I think it's important to approach sexual violence, right? To acknowledge its centrality in these texts. So I teach in a great books program sometimes. We start with the Iliad. You can't get very far in the Iliad without sexual violence happening, right? We have to talk about that from the beginning. But I think it's also important not to talk about it, and this is where I think sometimes well-intentioned progressive people go wrong, like as if it were something exceptional, when it's also something that's part of our everyday lives. And so I think all of that, I mean, it's sort of a balance, and maybe you just need to leave some more time to talk about it. But it's just, and we have similar issues, right, with racialized terms in ancient literature also, right? We don't want, and we've all like come across a gross old translation and had that feeling. We don't want to do that, but sort of think about, just talking about it, I think is important. More time. And room for discomfort, I think, is important.
First, thank you for coming. So, obviously, like those of us of faith, especially those of us in the Catholic Church, for the last few decades have had to deal with the revelation of this massive sexual violence happening in the church. And I know it can be dangerous to speculate on the causes of something like that, but do you see any connection between bad readings of stories like these and the kind of sexual violence we've had problems with in the church?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would love it if it were the case that good biblical reading could reduce sexual violence. I don't think that is the case, much as I wish that it were the case. I think that you can think about power and, right, the entanglement of power in scripture and sexual violence. I think I would say that this project of thinking about rape in the biblical text, I see my work as aligned with other people who are working on, for example, sexual abuse in the Catholic tradition, like the residential schools in Canada. So I think that it's all sort of connected, especially in thinking about the way that official language can authorize abuses of power, which include sexual abuses, is maybe one of the connections. I have some colleagues that are working on, like my colleague Kent Britnall, who teaches at UNC Charlotte, is doing some work around sexual abuse. So it's emerging as a field in religious studies. I don't think I would draw a causal relationship, but I think there certainly are some rich thematic overlaps.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe also similar structures of secrecy and knowing not to know, choosing not to talk, what we talk about in which groups, how we choose to avoid certain. So I think there's maybe some strategies there that are similar to rhetorical responses. And if you pointed out you're the bad affect in the room and everyone's unhappy.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.